The message arrived 3 hours before the wedding was supposed to happen, and it changed everything I thought I understood about power. I am Serene Vale, sovereign mother of the Caldron Dominion, ruler of 11 worlds, and mother to the only daughter who ever looked at me without fear. That morning, a courier from the Threx Assembly stood in my private hall and told me, with a smile I wanted to peel from his face, that his lord had already announced my daughter's engagement to the galaxy. Not proposed, announced, as if my consent was a formality he could skip. Lord Drevik Threx believed he had cornered me. His assembly had grown too powerful, and he knew that if his son married into my bloodline, he would have a claim to my throne within a generation. He thought I had no way out that would not cost me either my daughter's future or my dominion's stability. He was wrong, because he forgot one detail. Humans existed. I had met exactly one human before that day, a trade envoy named Daniel Hart, who had spent 18 months negotiating mineral rights on my outer colonies, with a patience that unsettled my entire council. He never raised his voice, he never postured. When my generals tried to intimidate him with displays of our fleet strength, he simply asked better questions until they ran out of answers. My advisors called him unimpressive. I called him unpredictable, which in my experience matters far more. So when Lord Drevik stood in my hall expecting me to either surrender my daughter to his son or humiliate myself by refusing a public engagement, I did something no one in that room expected. I announced that my daughter was already promised, to the human envoy, effective immediately, and that the wedding would take place before sundown. The room went silent in a way that only true shock can create. Lord Drevik's courier opened his mouth twice before words came out. He said it was an insult, that I was mocking the assembly by offering a human instead of accepting his lord's son. I told him it was not an insult at all. It was strategy. A human could not challenge my throne. A human had no bloodline claim, no assembly behind him, no army waiting for an excuse. In choosing Daniel Hart, I closed every door Lord Drevik thought he had opened. What I did not expect was my daughter's face when she heard the news. Kira Vale was 26 years old that day, sharp-minded, trained since birth to inherit a dominion, and she looked at me the way a soldier looks at a general who has just spent her life without asking. I remember her voice, low and controlled, the same tone I had taught her to use when she wanted to hide how angry she truly was. She asked me if I had lost my mind, marrying her to a species barely a century into star travel, a species my own scientists still debated whether to classify as fully sapient. I told her the truth. I told her this was never about Daniel Hart. It was about survival. Lord Drevik would not stop trying to claim my throne through marriage, and the only way to end the game permanently was to remove the board entirely. A human husband could not be leveraged the way a rival lord's son could. She did not speak to me again until the ceremony began. I remember the hall that evening more clearly than I remember most decades of my reign. Golden light fell through the high windows of the Vale Cathedral, and every noble family in the Dominion had gathered to witness what they assumed would be a farce. I could feel their judgment pressing against my back like a physical weight. A queen, marrying her only heir to a lesser species, out of spite, toward a rival lord. That was the story circulating through every whispering corner of that cathedral. Daniel Hart arrived without an entourage, without decoration, wearing a simple dark suit that made him look almost fragile among the towering forms of my court. My people stand nearly 2 heads taller than humans on average, and something about his stillness in that room made him seem even smaller. I expected him to be nervous. I expected sweat, hesitation, the human tendency toward visible discomfort that our observers had documented extensively. Instead, he walked to the center of that cathedral and looked directly at my daughter, and I saw something pass between them that I had not accounted for in my calculations. Not affection. Not yet. Recognition, perhaps. 2 people who had both just been handed a situation they did not choose, and both decided in the same instant not to let it break them. Kira stood beside him during the ceremony, with her spine perfectly straight, and her jaw locked tight enough that I worried she might crack a tooth. She said her vows without looking at me once. When the officiant asked Daniel Hart to speak his vows, he did something none of us expected. He spoke them in our language, in the old formal dialect reserved for royal ceremonies, a dialect so difficult that most of my own nobles avoid it in favor of common speech. He must have spent months learning it in secret. I watched Lord Drevik's courier standing near the back of the cathedral, his expression shifting from smugness to something closer to alarm, and I understood then that I had not simply avoided his trap. I had turned it into a weapon of my own, though I did not yet know what shape that weapon would eventually take. After the ceremony, protocol demanded a private audience between myself and the newly married couple. I remember the chamber we used, a small room with dark stone walls, chosen specifically because it had no windows and no listening devices that my counsel did not control personally. Kira sat across from me, still refusing to meet my eyes, while Daniel Hart stood near the door, with his hands folded in front of him. I told them plainly what I expected. This marriage was political. It would remain political. Kira would be stationed on one of our frontier worlds, far enough from the capital that Lord Drevik could not use proximity to stir rumors of instability, but close enough that our observers could monitor the situation. Daniel Hart would serve as a diplomatic liaison, nothing more. There would be no expectation of affection between them. I made that very clear, because I did not want my daughter to spend years hoping for something I did not believe a human was capable of providing. Kira finally looked at me then, and her voice was colder than I had ever heard it. She asked me if I had considered, even once, what she wanted. I told her that queens do not get to want things the way ordinary daughters do. I had learned that lesson from my own mother, and her mother before her, across 17 generations of rulers who sacrificed personal desire for the stability of our people. I expected Kira to understand that, eventually, even if she resented me for it in the moment. She stood up without another word and left the chamber, and Daniel Hart followed her a moment later, pausing at the door just long enough to look back at me. He said something I did not expect from a diplomat I had dismissed as unimpressive for 18 months. He said that he understood why I had done what I did, that he did not blame me for using him as a tool against Lord Drevik, but that he intended to make sure I regretted underestimating what that tool could become. I remember laughing, quietly, after the door closed behind him. I assumed it was simply human bravado, the kind of empty confidence our species had observed in their diplomats before, a trait our researchers referred to as compensatory posturing, a way for a physically weaker species to project strength it did not actually possess. I was sovereign mother of 11 worlds. I had negotiated with warlords who commanded fleets larger than entire star systems. I had outmaneuvered rivals who spent decades plotting my downfall. I believed, with total certainty, that I understood exactly what I had created that day. I had no idea how wrong I was. Within a week, my daughter and her human husband departed for Aldera Outpost, the frontier colony I had selected specifically because it was struggling, resource poor, barely worth the cost of maintaining a garrison there. I chose it deliberately. I wanted this marriage to feel like exile, a quiet corner of my dominion, where a political arrangement could exist without drawing attention, without becoming anything more significant than the insult I had intended it to be. I remember watching their transport ship leave orbit from the observation deck above my palace, and I remember feeling something I rarely allowed myself to feel as a ruler. Not guilt exactly. Something closer to unease, a small crack in my certainty that I chose to ignore, because a queen who second-guesses her own strategy is a queen who eventually falls. Lord Drevik's assembly quieted down considerably in the weeks that followed. Without a marriage claim to leverage, his plans to infiltrate my bloodline collapsed entirely, and for the first time in years, I felt the particular satisfaction of watching a rival's ambitions crumble without a single shot fired, without a single life lost, simply through the careful placement of one unexpected decision. I told myself the matter was settled. My daughter would serve her political duty on a forgotten frontier world. My throne would remain secure, and in time, perhaps, she would understand that I had protected her the only way I knew how. I had no way of knowing that on that same forgotten frontier world, something was beginning that would eventually reach further than my entire dominion. Something built not from politics or strategy, but from two people the galaxy had both underestimated, standing together in a place no one expected them to matter at all. I would not understand the true shape of what I had started until years later, when a summons reached my palace, carrying words I never imagined I would hear, words that would force me to leave my throne and travel to that same forgotten outpost, where I would discover exactly how badly I had misjudged the daughter I raised, and the husband I had chosen for her, out of nothing more than spite. I did not speak to my daughter for almost a year after the wedding, and I told myself the silence was her choice, not mine. It was easier to believe that than to admit I was avoiding the discomfort of hearing her voice and knowing exactly how much she resented me. My counsel kept me informed through official reports, the kind written by administrators who care more about resource allocation than human interest. Aldera Outpost was a mining colony on the edge of livable space, home to barely 12,000 people, most of them workers who had been assigned there because nowhere else wanted them. The soil was poor, the atmosphere required constant filtration. Half the original settlement structures had been condemned years before my daughter ever arrived, and the garrison stationed there existed mostly to remind the colonists that the Dominion had not entirely forgotten them. I expected the reports to describe exactly what I had planned. A quiet, uneventful posting. My daughter fulfilling her duty without complaint, because complaint would only prove to Lord Drevik and the rest of my court that the marriage had wounded her. Daniel Hart handling minor diplomatic tasks, perhaps mediating a few labor disputes, otherwise remaining invisible. Instead, the reports began describing something I did not recognize. Within the first 3 months, Daniel Hart had reorganized the outpost's failing irrigation system, using methods our engineers considered inefficient by our standards, but somehow produced better results in that specific soil composition. He had done this not through authority, but by spending weeks speaking with the colonists directly, learning what had failed before and why, in a way none of our previous administrators had ever bothered to attempt. By the 6th month, the reports mentioned my daughter appearing alongside him during these conversations, something that struck me as strange, since royal blood rarely involves itself in the daily concerns of frontier workers. The report described her asking questions about labor conditions, about food distribution, about matters a sovereign mother's heir had never been trained to care about. I dismissed it as a woman finding purpose in isolation, a way to fill the hours in a marriage she never wanted. By the 9th month, the reports changed tone entirely. A structural failure in the outpost's primary shelter dome had put nearly 4,000 colonists at risk during a seasonal storm, the kind of crisis that typically required weeks of Dominion assistance to resolve properly. My administrators expected significant loss. Instead, the report described Daniel Hart organizing the colonists into work teams using a method he called triage prioritization, something apparently common in human disaster response, but entirely foreign to our engineering doctrine, which relies on centralized command structures that move slowly by comparison. The dome was stabilized within 30 hours. Not a single life was lost. I remember reading that particular report twice, sitting alone in my private study, feeling something I did not want to name. My advisors, when I brought it to council, suggested the report had been exaggerated by an administrator eager to justify his posting. I wanted to believe that explanation, because the alternative meant admitting a human diplomat had solved a crisis my own engineers would have handled far less efficiently. I did not visit Aldera Outpost that year. I told myself I was too occupied with Dominion affairs, that a sovereign mother does not simply travel to a forgotten frontier world to check on a marriage she engineered as a political maneuver. The truth, which I only admitted to myself much later, was that I was afraid of what I would find there, and afraid of what it might mean about the choices I had made. Lord Drevik, to his credit, tried twice during that first year to reignite tensions, spreading rumors through the assembly that my daughter's marriage was a failure, that Aldera Outpost was crumbling under human incompetence, that I had made a fatal error, underestimating how much the Dominion needed strong bloodline alliances, rather than a queen's petty games. Each time, the official reports contradicted him so thoroughly that his accusations collapsed under their own weight, and each time, my confidence in my original decision grew, even as my curiosity about my daughter's actual life grew alongside it. I received my first direct message from Kira, almost 14 months after the wedding. It was brief, formal, requesting additional medical supplies for the outpost's growing clinic. I noticed she did not address me as her mother in the message. She addressed me as Sovereign Mother, the same title any citizen would use, and something about that formality cut deeper than any angry words could have. I approved the request within the hour, and added a personal note asking how she was adjusting to frontier life. She did not respond to the personal note. She simply confirmed receipt of the supplies 3 weeks later, through an administrative channel, without a single word beyond the required acknowledgement. I told myself that was fine. I told myself a queen does not need her daughter's warmth to justify her decisions. The second year brought stranger reports still. Aldera Outpost, once considered barely worth maintaining, began exporting refined minerals at nearly double the previous rate, using extraction techniques my geological surveys had never considered viable for that particular terrain. The colony's population grew as workers from neighboring outposts requested transfer there, drawn by conditions that administrators described as unusually stable for a frontier world. I began receiving informal messages from other governors, curious about what exactly was happening on a colony that had been written off years before. I did not have good answers for them. I had reports full of numbers and outcomes, but very little understanding of the reasoning behind them. It was during the third year that I finally received a transmission directly from my daughter's own voice, rather than through administrative channels. The transmission arrived late in the evening, and I remember my hands trembling slightly as I opened it, a reaction I had not experienced in decades of ruling a dominion through wars, betrayals, and every manner of political crisis. My daughter's face appeared on the screen, older than I remembered, her expression harder to read than it had ever been during her childhood. She informed me, in a tone I did not recognize, that she and Daniel Hart had successfully negotiated a resource agreement with a neighboring system that had previously refused all contact with our dominion for nearly 2 decades. She explained that Daniel had approached the negotiation using something he called mutual benefit framing, a concept apparently common in human diplomacy, treating the other system not as a subject to be managed, but as an equal partner whose interests deserved genuine consideration. The agreement she described would have taken my most experienced diplomats years to secure, if they managed it at all. I asked her, carefully, how she had come to understand these methods so thoroughly herself, since the report suggested she had led significant portions of the negotiation independently. Her answer stayed with me long after the transmission ended. She said that Daniel had taught her to listen differently, not to listen for weakness to exploit, the way our diplomatic training emphasized, but to listen for what people actually needed, and to build agreements around that, instead of around leverage. She said it felt strange at first, almost dishonest, because our entire political culture treated vulnerability as something to be used against an opponent rather than understood. She said something else, something I did not expect. She said she had started to enjoy the work in a way she never enjoyed her training at the Capitol, because for the first time, she was solving problems that actually mattered to real people, rather than maneuvering within a court, obsessed with appearances and inherited status. I did not know what to say to that, so I said very little, and the transmission ended shortly afterward. I continued receiving reports throughout the following year, each one describing improvements at Aldera Outpost that seemed increasingly impossible for a colony I had once considered a punishment posting. New agricultural methods that increased food output beyond anything our own frontier worlds achieved. A local governance system that Daniel Hart apparently helped design, blending our Dominion's administrative structure with concepts he called checks and balances, something that reduced corruption complaints from the colony to nearly zero within 18 months. I began to understand, slowly and reluctantly, that what I had created was not the quiet exile I intended. It was becoming something else entirely, something I did not yet have the vocabulary to properly describe. Lord Drevick's assembly grew quieter during this period, not because he had given up his ambitions, but because the story circulating through the Dominion no longer served his interests. No one believed the marriage was a failure anymore. Instead, whispers began suggesting that Aldera Outpost had become the most efficiently governed colony in my entire Dominion, and that whatever my daughter and her human husband were doing there deserved far closer attention than I had originally intended to give it. I still did not visit. Pride kept me away, along with something harder to admit, a growing awareness that if I traveled to that outpost and witnessed firsthand what my daughter had built, I would have to reconsider everything I believed about the species I had once dismissed as unimpressive, and about the daughter I had once believed needed my protection more than she needed my trust. The years continued to pass in this manner, each one bringing reports of quiet, steady transformation, until a message arrived that finally forced me to abandon the distance I had maintained for so long. That message did not come from an administrator, and it did not come through official channels. It came directly from my daughter, marked with an urgency classification I had not seen used in nearly a decade, requesting my immediate presence at Aldera Outpost, for reasons the message described only as a matter concerning the future security of the entire frontier region. I remember staring at that message for a long time before responding, aware that whatever waited for me on that forgotten outpost would change something fundamental about how I understood my daughter, her husband, and the choices I had made on that wedding day years before. I gave the order to prepare my transport within the hour. The alert reached my flagship before we even entered the outer edge of the Aldera system, and it told me exactly how serious the situation had become. A compact battle group, nearly 40 vessels strong, had moved into position along the trade corridor bordering the outpost, and their formation carried none of the signals normally associated with routine patrol movements. I had commanded fleets for decades. I recognized a staging pattern the moment I saw it on the tactical display, and my chest tightened with a fear I had not felt since the early years of my reign, when survival was never guaranteed. My daughter's urgent summons suddenly made complete sense. I ordered my communications officer to establish contact with Aldera Outpost immediately, and within minutes, my daughter's voice filled the bridge, steady in a way that surprised me given the circumstances. She explained the situation with the precision of a seasoned commander, rather than the frightened colonist administrator I had half expected to find. The compact fleet belonged to Commander Corvain, a rising figure among the neighboring systems who had spent years consolidating influence through intimidation rather than negotiation. He had grown increasingly aggressive toward independent frontier colonies, absorbing 3 smaller settlements over the previous 2 years, through what he euphemistically called protective alliance agreements, arrangements that left the absorbed populations with almost no autonomy remaining. Aldera Outpost, once dismissed by my own council as barely worth defending, had grown into something Commander Corvain apparently viewed as a threat significant enough to warrant this level of military presence. My daughter explained that his fleet had arrived 4 days earlier, demanding the outpost submit to a similar protective alliance, or face what he described only as consequences. I asked her, my voice tighter than I intended, what defenses the outpost currently possessed against a fleet of that size. My garrison assignment there had never been substantial, since the colony's original value never justified significant military investment. Her answer surprised me more than anything I had read in the reports over the previous years. She told me the outpost was prepared to hold, and she said it with a calm certainty that made me question whether she fully understood the danger facing her. I demanded she explain herself, and for the first time since her wedding day, I heard something in her voice that resembled the confidence I once had as a much younger queen, before decades of political compromise wore it down into caution. She told me to arrive and see for myself. My transport reached orbit above Aldera Outpost less than 6 hours later, and what I witnessed from the observation deck defied every expectation I carried from those years of administrative reports. The colony I remembered as barely functional, scraping by on inefficient infrastructure and a population too small to matter strategically, had transformed into something resembling a fortress world. Defensive platforms ringed the planet at precise intervals, their configuration unlike any our Dominion's engineering doctrine typically produced. Shield generators, larger and more numerous than the modest colony should have possessed, projected an energy barrier across the entire settlement zone, one that my tactical officers confirmed would require significant sustained effort to breach. I demanded to know how a colony with no substantial military budget had constructed defenses of this caliber, and the answer, when it came, forced me to reconsider everything I believed about my daughter's exile. She had built it herself, alongside her husband, using resources generated through the very trade agreements and mineral exports that had seemed like minor economic footnotes in the reports I received over the years. What I had dismissed as background administrative details had actually been the foundation of a defensive infrastructure my own council would have taken a decade and significant budget allocation to construct properly. My transport descended to the outpost's landing platform, and I stepped out to find my daughter waiting for me, flanked not by ceremonial guards, but by a mixed command staff of Veil officers and human colonists, all wearing matching insignia I did not recognize, a design that combined elements of our Dominion's traditional crest with something distinctly human in its geometry. She looked different than I remembered. Older, certainly, but carrying herself with an authority that felt entirely her own, rather than inherited from my example. She greeted me formally, as protocol demanded, but something in her posture suggested she was no longer the daughter who once left a chamber without a word, wounded by decisions made without her input. She stood now as someone who had built her own foundation, independent of the throne she once expected to inherit. Daniel Hart arrived a moment later, and the years had changed him as well. Whatever fragility I once perceived in him during that first ceremony had been replaced by a quiet, grounded presence that commanded attention, without requiring volume or spectacle. He greeted me with respect but not deference, and I found myself recalculating my assumptions about him in real time. They led me to a command center built into the outpost's central structure, and there I finally understood the true scope of what they had constructed over the years I had chosen to remain distant. The room contained tactical displays showing defensive contingencies for scenarios ranging from small raiding parties to full battle group assaults, each one developed through years of careful planning, rather than the reactive scrambling I expected from a frontier colony. My daughter explained that after the third year, following two smaller incidents involving pirates testing the outpost's defenses, she and Daniel had concluded that Aldera's growing economic value would eventually attract more significant threats, and they had spent the following years preparing accordingly. I asked why none of this had appeared in the administrative reports I received. Daniel Hart answered that question himself, and his explanation revealed a strategic patience I did not expect from either of them. He said that if the Dominion's official channels knew the full extent of Aldera's defensive capabilities, word would inevitably spread, and any advantage gained through surprise would be lost the moment a rival power learned exactly what they were dealing with. Better, he said, to let outsiders continue believing the outpost remained a modest frontier settlement, until the moment that assumption worked against them, rather than in their favor. I found myself impressed, despite every instinct telling me a queen should not feel impressed, by strategies kept hidden from her own throne. The tactical briefing continued for nearly 2 hours, during which I learned that Commander Corvain's battle group, despite its impressive numbers, had made a critical miscalculation. His intelligence networks, apparently reliant on outdated reports similar to the ones my own council had trusted, believed Aldera Outpost remained vulnerable and undefended, an easy target for intimidation before absorption into his growing sphere of influence. My daughter intended to let him discover the truth at the worst possible moment for his forces. I asked her directly whether she intended to engage the compact fleet in open conflict, a decision that carried enormous risk regardless of Aldera's defensive preparations. Commander Corvain's forces still outnumbered the outpost's garrison significantly, and even the most carefully prepared defenses could fail against a sufficiently determined assault. She told me her plan did not rely primarily on military confrontation at all. Instead, she and Daniel had spent the previous 4 days engaging Commander Corvain in extended negotiations, stalling for time, while simultaneously reaching out through diplomatic channels neither Corvain nor my own council knew existed. Aldera's economic partnerships, built quietly over the years through fair and mutually beneficial agreements, rather than the extractive arrangements typical of Dominion expansion, meant that several neighboring systems had genuine investment in the outpost's continued independence. She explained that within hours of Corvain's fleet arriving, she had sent coded requests to 4 allied systems, each of whom had benefited significantly from trade relationships Aldera had cultivated over the years. These systems, none of them formally part of my dominion, had agreed to send their own forces in support, not out of obligation to me or my throne, but because they recognized that Corvain's aggressive expansion threatened their own economic stability as much as it threatened Aldera's. I sat with that information for a long moment, processing the implications. My daughter had built, entirely independent of my dominion's resources and without my knowledge, a network of alliances based on principles our political culture rarely employed. Not conquest, not intimidation, genuine partnership, the kind that generated loyalty precisely because it demanded nothing beyond fair exchange. Daniel Hart added something during that briefing that I have not forgotten since. He said that back on his homeworld, humans had spent centuries learning a difficult lesson, that alliances built on fear tend to collapse the moment fear no longer serves as sufficient motivation, while alliances built on genuine mutual benefit tend to hold even under significant pressure, because the parties involved have real reasons to want each other to succeed. I thought of Lord Drevik and every rival I had outmaneuvered over the decades through calculated fear and strategic leverage, and I wondered, for the first time in my long reign, whether the foundation of my entire Dominion's political structure rested on something far less stable than I had always assumed. Commander Corvain's ultimatum deadline arrived the following morning, and I stood in the command center alongside my daughter and her husband as his fleet began final positioning for what our tactical officers described as an imminent assault posture. I felt the old instincts of a war commander rising in me, the urge to take direct control, to issue orders based on decades of my own experience, rather than trusting a plan built by two people I had once considered inexperienced. I restrained that urge, and I am grateful now that I did. My daughter opened a direct channel to Commander Corvain's flagship, and I watched her negotiate with a composure that reminded me of my own younger self, though tempered by something I never quite mastered during my own early reign: a genuine willingness to acknowledge an opponent's position without conceding her own. She informed Corvain that Aldera Outpost would not submit to his protective alliance terms, and that any attempt to force compliance through military action would be met with resistance from a coalition far larger than his intelligence had accounted for. Commander Corvain laughed at her, visible on the shared view screen, dismissing her claims as an obvious bluff from a colony his reports described as barely capable of basic self-defense. That was the moment the tactical display updated, and 4 additional fleets emerged from concealed positions along the system's outer boundary, formations belonging to allied systems whose participation Corvain's intelligence had entirely failed to anticipate. Combined with Aldera's own reinforced defenses, the numbers shifted dramatically against him, transforming what he believed would be an easy conquest into a confrontation he could not reasonably win. I watched his expression change through the view screen, confidence collapsing into the same recalculation I myself had been forced through over the previous hours. Commander Corvain withdrew his ultimatum within the hour, choosing a tactical retreat rather than risk his fleet in a confrontation with unfavorable odds. His battle group departed the system by the following morning, and Aldera Outpost, the frontier colony I had once considered barely worth maintaining, had successfully defended itself not through overwhelming force alone, but through years of careful, patient relationship building that my own political instincts would never have prioritized. Standing in that command center afterward, surrounded by officers who had trusted my daughter's judgment, through a crisis that could have ended in disaster, I finally allowed myself to ask the question I had avoided for years. I asked Kira how she had learned to build something like this, an entire coalition based on principles so different from everything I had taught her during her training to inherit my throne. She looked at me for a long moment before answering, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried none of the anger I remembered from our final conversation before her wedding. She said she had learned it from Daniel, but more than that, she had learned it from watching what happened when people were treated as partners rather than pieces to be managed. She said the outpost's success was not built, despite the limitations I had assigned to that marriage, but because those limitations had forced her to discover an entirely different way of governing, one she never would have found if she had remained at the capital under my direct influence. I did not know how to respond to that, so I said nothing, and we stood together in silence, watching the tactical display clear as Corvain's fleet finally left the system entirely. It was Daniel Hart who spoke next, mentioning almost casually that there was someone else waiting to meet me, someone who had been eager for this reunion for longer than I realized. I asked him what he meant, and the answer he gave prepared me for absolutely nothing that followed. He told me my grandchildren had been waiting all morning for the chance to finally meet the grandmother they had heard so many stories about, and that whatever I thought I understood about this outpost, about my daughter, and about the choices I had made years before, I was about to understand something far more significant still. I had never once considered, in all the years I distanced myself from Aldera Outpost, that my absence had cost me something as significant as the chance to know my own grandchildren before that morning. Daniel led me through a corridor connecting the command center to a residential wing I had not seen during the tactical briefing, and with every step, I felt something shifting inside me that I did not fully understand until the doors opened ahead of us. 2 young figures stood waiting in the room beyond, and the moment I saw them, I understood immediately why the reports over the years had described things our own scientists insisted should not be possible. The compact had long maintained, through careful genetic study, that Vale and human biology were fundamentally incompatible for reproduction, a conclusion my own scientific council had repeated to me more than once during those years I remained distant from my daughter's life. Standing in that room, Looking at two children who clearly disproved every assumption our researchers had built their careers upon, I felt something between wonder and quiet embarrassment at how confidently we had all been wrong. The elder of the two, a young man who appeared perhaps 16 years by human reckoning, stood with a posture that combined the height and bearing of our own royal line with something distinctly grounded, a stillness that reminded me strongly of Daniel Hart during that first ceremony years before. His name, I learned, was Owen Hart, and his eyes carried the pale gray coloring common to my own bloodline, though softened by a warmth I rarely saw among Vale nobility. The younger, a girl who could not have been more than 12, introduced herself as Lena, and her energy filled the room in a way that immediately reminded me of Kira as a child, quick and curious, unwilling to remain quiet simply because an important visitor had arrived. She looked at me directly, without the deference our culture typically expects from children toward royalty, and asked whether I was truly the same grandmother who had arranged her parents' marriage as an insult toward another lord. I did not know how to answer that question honestly in front of her, so I simply confirmed it was true, and braced myself for whatever judgment a 12-year-old might offer regarding decisions that had shaped her entire existence. Instead, she smiled, and told me that whatever my original intentions had been, she was glad it worked out the way it did, because otherwise she would not exist at all, and she quite enjoyed existing. I found myself unable to respond immediately, caught between the political instincts that had guided every interaction of my long reign and something far simpler, an emotion I had not expected to feel standing in that room. Something that resembled, more than anything else, a grandmother's pride, arriving decades later than it should have. Owen, more reserved than his younger sister, asked whether I would like to see what he had been working on, and led me toward a workshop adjoining the residential wing. What I found there challenged nearly everything I believed about the limitations of both Vale and human engineering traditions. Spread across several workstations were components from the outpost's shield generator array, the same defensive technology that had protected the colony from Commander Corvain's fleet only hours before. Owen explained, with a technical precision that surprised me given his age, that he had spent the previous 2 years redesigning the shield harmonics using a hybrid approach that combined our Dominion's traditional energy distribution methods with human resonance theory, a field of study I had never heard our own engineers reference before. The result, he explained, was a shield configuration nearly 40% more efficient than standard Dominion designs, requiring significantly less power to maintain the same defensive strength. I asked him where he had learned resonance theory, since it was not a concept taught within any Vale educational institution I was aware of. He told me he had taught himself, using archived human research materials Daniel had brought to the outpost years before, combined with concepts he had absorbed from Vale tutors sent by my own administration to provide his formal education. He said something then that struck me deeply, that he never understood why anyone would limit themselves to only one tradition of knowledge when two entirely different ways of understanding the universe were available to study side by side. I thought of my own scientific council, rigid in their adherence to established Vale methodology, dismissive of any approach that did not originate from our own long history of research, and I wondered how much progress our Dominion had sacrificed over generations simply through unwillingness to consider ideas from outside our own tradition. Lena, unwilling to let her brother's demonstration go unanswered, pulled me toward a different section of the workshop and showed me something equally remarkable, though in a completely different domain. She had, over the previous year, developed what she called a mediation framework, a structured negotiation method she used to help resolve disputes among the outpost's growing population, disputes that ranged from resource allocation disagreements to conflicts between Vale and human colonists over cultural differences in daily life. She explained her method with an enthusiasm that reminded me powerfully of her mother, though her approach carried none of the calculated leverage that defined traditional Vale diplomacy. Instead, she focused entirely on identifying what she called underlying needs, the actual concerns motivating each party's position, rather than the surface demands they initially presented. She said that once people understood their opponent actually wanted to solve the same underlying problem, most conflicts became far easier to resolve than anyone expected. I asked her how frequently colonists actually sought her assistance for such matters, expecting her to admit this was mostly a theoretical exercise given her young age. She told me, matter-of-factly, that she had personally mediated over 30 disputes in the previous 6 months alone, and that the outpost's formal dispute resolution office had begun referring particularly difficult cases to her directly, because her success rate exceeded that of the trained administrators employed for that exact purpose. I stood in that workshop, surrounded by evidence of accomplishments that would have impressed me from adults with decades of specialized training, and slowly began to understand the true magnitude of what Kira and Daniel had built during the years I remained deliberately distant. They had not simply created a successful colony or a stable marriage, despite the limitations I had imposed upon them. They had raised children who represented something genuinely new, combining the strengths of two species in ways that produced capabilities neither species had achieved entirely on its own. Kira found us there sometime later, watching quietly from the workshop entrance, as Owen explained his shield modifications to me in increasing technical detail, and Lena interrupted periodically with questions about my own experiences negotiating Dominion politics, comparing my methods against her own mediation framework, with a directness that would have been considered disrespectful from any other 12-year-old addressing a sovereign mother. My daughter told me later, once the children had returned to their studies, that Owen and Lena represented only 2 examples of a broader pattern emerging across Aldera Outpost. Several other hybrid children, born to Vale and human parents who had settled the colony over the previous years, showed similar patterns of accelerated development and hybrid thinking, combining perspectives that neither parent species had access to independently. She explained that the Compact's original genetic assessments, the ones declaring Vale and human reproduction biologically impossible, had been based on incomplete understanding of both species' genetic flexibility. Daniel, drawing on human medical research largely unknown to our own scientists, had worked alongside Aldera's small medical staff to identify compatibility factors our own researchers had simply never considered testing, given their prior assumption that such compatibility could not exist in the first place. I asked her whether she had reported these findings to the Dominion's Scientific Council, information that could reshape our understanding of interspecies biology in ways with significant long-term implications. She told me she had not, and her reasoning echoed the same strategic patience Daniel had demonstrated regarding the outpost's defensive capabilities. She said that once other powers understood what Aldera had achieved, both scientifically and politically, the outpost would attract far more attention than it currently could safely manage, attention from rivals who might see hybrid children not as a scientific marvel worth celebrating, but as a threat, requiring elimination before the pattern could spread further. I understood her caution immediately, having spent decades navigating exactly the kind of political dangers she was describing. A dominion built on rigid bloodline succession and species hierarchy would not necessarily welcome evidence that those hierarchies were far less fixed than centuries of assumption had suggested. That evening, Kira arranged a private meal for the 4 of us, myself, her, Daniel, and their children, in a modest dining room within the residential wing, rather than any of the formal reception halls the outpost maintained for official visitors. It was the first time in years I had shared a meal with my daughter outside the confines of political ceremony, and I found myself unexpectedly moved by the simplicity of the gathering. Owen asked me questions about my own childhood, curious how a sovereign mother had been raised differently than he and his sister were being raised now. Lena interrupted frequently with her own observations, comparing Dominion traditions against human customs Daniel had shared with them over the years, drawing conclusions with a confidence that suggested she had spent considerable time thinking through these comparisons long before my arrival. Daniel spoke little during the meal, content mostly to watch his children engage with a grandmother they had clearly wanted to know for years, but he offered one observation that stayed with me long after the evening ended. He said that raising Owen and Lena had taught him something about combining differences rather than choosing between them, a lesson he believed applied equally well to marriages, to colonies, and perhaps even to entire civilizations, navigating first contact with species unlike themselves. I left that meal with a weight in my chest I had not expected to carry, a mixture of pride in what my daughter had built and quiet grief for the years I had missed, simply because pride and fear had kept me from visiting sooner. I did not yet know, as that evening ended, that the peace we had just secured against Commander Corvain's fleet would prove temporary, and that within days, a far greater threat would emerge, one that would test not only Aldera Outpost defenses, but everything my daughter, her husband, and their remarkable children had built together, Over years I had spent watching from a comfortable distance, rather than standing beside them where I belonged. The second alert came 4 days after Commander Corvain's retreat, and this time the threat carried a name that made every officer in the command center fall silent the moment it appeared on the tactical display. Grand Marshal Renata Voss commanded the Compact's Central Enforcement Fleet, a position of authority far beyond anything Commander Corvain had ever possessed. Where Corvain operated on ambition and opportunistic expansion, Voss represented the full institutional weight of the Compact itself, dispatched directly in response to reports that had finally reached the Central Authority, describing an independent frontier colony, capable of defeating a full battle group through a combination of defensive innovation and diplomatic coalition building. I understood immediately what this meant. Corvain's failure had not discouraged further aggression against Aldera Outpost. It had escalated the situation into something the Compact's leadership considered a direct challenge to their authority across the entire region, a precedent they could not allow to stand unanswered. My daughter received the formal notification of Voss's approach through an official diplomatic channel, unusual for the Compact, which typically preferred to demonstrate power through unannounced arrivals, rather than formal warning. Daniel explained that this formality itself carried significance, suggesting Voss intended this confrontation to be remembered as a lawful correction, rather than an act of aggression, a distinction that mattered enormously for how the wider region would interpret whatever happened next. Voss's fleet numbered nearly 90 vessels, more than double the size of Corvain's force, and included several capital ships whose specifications, according to my own military advisors traveling with me, exceeded anything currently in my Dominion's active fleet. This was not a force meant to intimidate. This was a force built to conclude any confrontation decisively, regardless of whatever coalition Aldera Outpost might assemble in response. I watched my daughter process this information with the same composure she had shown during Corvain's ultimatum, but I noticed something different in her expression this time, an awareness that the strategies which had succeeded against a lesser threat might prove insufficient against an adversary of this magnitude. She called an emergency council within the hour, gathering not only her military command staff but Daniel, Owen, Lena, and myself, a decision that surprised me until I understood her reasoning. She explained that the children's unconventional thinking had already produced solutions the rest of us had overlooked, and she was not prepared to exclude them from strategic planning, simply because tradition suggested children had no place in matters of war. Owen spoke first, and what he proposed reshaped the entire defensive strategy we ultimately pursued. He explained that Voss's fleet, built around standard compact doctrine, would almost certainly rely on coordinated shield frequency patterns across her capital ships, a defensive approach that provided mutual reinforcement between vessels, but created a specific vulnerability if the pattern itself could be disrupted, rather than simply overwhelmed through brute force. He believed his hybrid shield harmonics, the same technology he had shown me during my tour of the workshop, could be inverted to create a localized disruption field, one capable of temporarily desynchronizing the compact fleet's shield coordination without requiring Aldera's own defenses to engage in a direct confrontation that would likely prove costly, regardless of outcome. My military advisors, trained in decades of traditional veil tactics, expressed immediate skepticism, noting that no Dominion engineering theory supported the kind of harmonic disruption Owen described. I found myself, for the first time in my long career as a military commander, deferring to the judgment of a 16-year-old boy over officers who had served my throne for years, because I had already witnessed enough evidence during my brief time on that outpost to trust that unconventional thinking sometimes achieved what traditional doctrine could not. Lena's contribution came next, and it addressed a different aspect of the crisis entirely. She proposed reaching out to Grand Marshal Voss directly, not through the coalition-based deterrence that had worked against Corvain, but through a personal appeal grounded in her mediation framework, an attempt to identify whatever underlying concerns motivated the Compact's aggressive response, beyond the simple assumption that Voss sought conquest for its own sake. She argued that the Compact's leadership likely viewed Aldera Outpost's success as a destabilizing precedent, one that threatened their broader system of species hierarchy across the region, rather than viewing the colony itself as valuable territory worth acquiring. If that assessment was correct, military confrontation alone would never resolve the underlying tension, regardless of who won any single battle. because the compact would simply return with greater force until the precedent was eliminated entirely or their own authority collapsed under the pressure of losing repeatedly to a colony they considered beneath serious consideration. Kira listened to both her children's proposals with visible pride, but also with the careful calculation of a leader who understood that combining an untested engineering theory with an unprecedented diplomatic gambit represented enormous risk if either element failed to perform as expected. Daniel offered the final piece of the strategy, drawing on something from human history he called asymmetric negotiation, the practice of demonstrating capability before entering negotiation, rather than negotiating from a position of assumed weakness. He suggested allowing Owen's disruption technology to function as a visible demonstration during the opening moments of any confrontation, proving decisively that Aldera Outpost possessed genuine capability to resist the compact's full military force, before Lena's diplomatic approach attempted to redirect the confrontation toward negotiated resolution rather than continued conflict. The combined plan required precise timing and no small measure of faith in technology that had never been tested against a force of this magnitude. I found myself, as sovereign mother of 11 worlds with decades of military experience, deferring entirely to a strategy conceived largely by two children and their parents, because every alternative I could construct from traditional Dominion doctrine offered significantly worse odds against Voss's overwhelming numerical advantage. Grand Marshal Voss's fleet arrived at the edge of the Aldera system 3 days later, and I stood once again in the outpost's command center, this time with a tension in my chest that felt different from anything I had experienced during Corvain's earlier threat. This confrontation carried consequences beyond a single colony's independence. If Voss succeeded here, the message would reach every corner of the region, confirming that hybrid innovation and coalition diplomacy could never truly challenge the compact's established authority, regardless of how cleverly deployed. Voss opened communication almost immediately upon arrival, her presence on the view screen carrying an authority far more measured and dangerous than Corvain's brash confidence had ever suggested. She addressed my daughter directly, acknowledging Kira's status as heir to a significant dominion, but making clear that her mission here concerned Aldera Outpost specifically, an independent settlement whose growing influence the compact could no longer permit to continue unchecked. My daughter responded with a composure that made me proud, in a way I had rarely felt during her childhood training at the capital. She informed Voss that Aldera Outpost had no intention of submitting to compact authority, but also expressed genuine willingness to discuss whatever specific concerns motivated this confrontation, provided that discussion occurred as equals, rather than through the kind of ultimatum Commander Corvain had previously attempted. Voss's expression shifted slightly, and I recognized in that small change something significant, a moment of genuine surprise from a commander accustomed to negotiations conducted entirely on her own terms. She responded that Aldera's continued independence represented an unacceptable precedent for regional stability, one the compact could not allow to persist, regardless of whatever diplomatic overtures my daughter offered. She indicated her fleet would begin engagement procedures within the hour, unless Aldera agreed to immediate and unconditional submission to compact oversight. This was the moment Owen's disruption technology needed to prove itself. As Voss's fleet began advancing formation, Owen activated the modified harmonic array from a secondary control station within the command center, and I watched the tactical display with a tension I had rarely experienced even during the most desperate moments of my own military career. For several agonizing seconds, nothing appeared to happen, and I saw doubt flicker across even my daughter's normally composed expression. Then, gradually, the compact fleet's shield readings began fluctuating across our sensors, their coordinated defensive pattern destabilizing exactly as Owen had theorized, forcing several of Voss's capital ships to break formation entirely as their crews scrambled to restore proper shield synchronization. The disruption did not disable their defenses completely, but it created enough visible confusion across the fleet that even Voss's own bridge crew, visible briefly through the shared communication channel, appeared momentarily uncertain how to respond to a countermeasure their doctrine had never encountered before. Grand Marshal Voss's expression shifted from measured authority to something closer to genuine reassessment, and I understood that Owen's demonstration had accomplished exactly what Daniel's strategy intended. The compact's confidence in overwhelming numerical superiority had just been visibly challenged by technology their own scientific councils would have insisted was theoretically impossible, produced not by a rival Dominion's military research division, but by a 16-year-old boy working from a frontier colony workshop. This was the moment Lena stepped forward, requesting to speak directly with Grand Marshal Voss, a request that startled even my own advisors given the girl's age and the gravity of the ongoing confrontation. Kira, trusting her daughter's judgment despite the enormous stakes involved, granted the request, and Lena addressed Voss with a calm sincerity that felt almost jarring against the backdrop of active military confrontation unfolding around us. She told Voss that she understood the compact's concern was not truly about Aldera Outpost's specific resources or territory, but about the precedent of an independent colony, successfully resisting compact authority, through methods the established hierarchy had never anticipated. She acknowledged that this precedent genuinely threatened the stability of a system Voss had spent her career protecting, and she did not dismiss that concern as illegitimate simply because it worked against Aldera's own interests. Instead, she proposed something none of us had discussed during our strategic planning, an idea she said had come to her only in that moment, watching Voss's expression during the shield disruption. She suggested that rather than framing this confrontation as submission versus continued conflict, the compact might instead consider a formal recognition agreement, one that acknowledged Aldera Outpost's independent status, while establishing clear cooperative protocols regarding trade, security coordination, and technological exchange, an arrangement that would allow the compact to claim credit for successfully managing an unprecedented situation through diplomatic wisdom, rather than admitting an embarrassing defeat at the hands of a colony they had previously dismissed as insignificant. I watched Grand Marshal Voss consider this proposal with visible calculation, weighing the political value of framing this outcome as her own diplomatic achievement against the alternative of continuing a confrontation that had already proven far more costly and uncertain than her intelligence reports had led her to expect. The negotiation that followed stretched across nearly 6 hours, involving detailed discussion of terms that would ultimately reshape not only Aldera Outpost's relationship with the compact, but the broader precedent for how independent colonies throughout the region might negotiate their own status going forward. My daughter led much of the technical negotiation, drawing on years of experience building the trade agreements that had originally attracted Allied support during Corvain's earlier threat. Daniel contributed insight into framing terms in ways that allowed both parties to claim meaningful victory, avoiding the kind of humiliating concession that might provoke future retaliation from a compact leadership eager to save face. Owen provided technical specifications regarding what defensive technology Aldera would agree to share under the cooperative protocols, calibrated carefully to demonstrate goodwill without surrendering the innovations that had proven decisive during the confrontation itself. Lena, throughout the negotiation, continued applying her mediation framework whenever tensions threatened to derail progress, identifying underlying concerns beneath surface disagreements with an instinct that impressed even Grand Marshal Voss's own senior diplomatic staff. By the time the agreement reached its final form, Aldera Outpost had secured recognition as an independent territory with formal cooperative status alongside the compact, a position no frontier colony in the region had ever previously achieved through negotiation rather than either complete submission or prolonged costly conflict. Grand Marshal Voss withdrew her fleet that evening, carrying with her an agreement she would present to compact leadership as evidence of measured, effective diplomacy, rather than the embarrassing military failure it might otherwise have represented. I stood on the outpost landing platform that night, watching the last of Voss's ships depart from orbit, and found myself reflecting on everything that had unfolded since that wedding day years before, when I had arranged a marriage, intended purely as a political insult toward a rival lord. I had believed, with complete confidence at the time, that I understood exactly what I had created. A quiet exile for a daughter who threatened Lord Drevik's ambitions, a human diplomat too insignificant to pose any real challenge to my throne, a marriage designed to close doors rather than open new possibilities. Instead, I had created something that reshaped an entire region's understanding of what was possible when two different species combined their strengths, rather than viewing each other through the lens of hierarchy and competition. My daughter had built a coalition, based on genuine partnership rather than fear-based leverage. Daniel Hart had proven that the species I once dismissed as unimpressive possessed strategic wisdom my own dominion's traditional training had never emphasized. Owen and Lena represented an entirely new kind of thinking, one that drew from both their parents' traditions to produce solutions neither species could have achieved independently. Kira found me standing alone on that platform, and for the first time since her wedding day, she stood beside me without the guarded distance that had defined our relationship for so many years. She told me she understood now why I had made the choice I made all those years ago, even if she still believed I should have consulted her before making it. She said that whatever my original intentions had been, the outcome had given her a life and a purpose she never would have found remaining at the capital, preparing to inherit a throne built on traditions she had come to question deeply during her years on this frontier world. I told her honestly that I had been wrong about many things regarding this marriage, but that watching what she and Daniel had built, and meeting the remarkable children they had raised together, had taught me something about my own dominion I had never properly understood before that visit. That strength did not always come from bloodline, hierarchy, or overwhelming military force, but sometimes from the willingness to combine differences rather than exploit them, to build partnerships based on genuine mutual benefit rather than calculated leverage. Owen and Lena joined us on that platform a short while later, and as I stood surrounded by my daughter, her husband, and their children, I understood finally that the insult I had intended all those years before had become something far more valuable than any political maneuver I had ever executed during my long reign. I had arranged a marriage meant to close doors and eliminate threats to my throne, and instead, without ever intending it, I had helped create a family capable of reshaping the future of an entire region, one built not on the assumptions of my own dominion's rigid traditions, but on something new, entirely, something the wider galaxy was only beginning to understand the true value of. As I prepared to return to my own capital the following morning, I made a decision I never would have considered before that visit. I would return to Aldera Outpost regularly from that point forward, not as a sovereign mother monitoring a political arrangement from a careful distance, but as a grandmother who had finally learned, years later than she should have, exactly how much she had been missing all along.